Should be on now. Okay. So we're going to we're going to hit 9, especially, we're going to hit the Gibeonite, kind of focus on that tonight. And then we'll move into the other things. But I did want to, we'll talk about this here in a moment because it's kind of a map of the southern conquest of Israel. So before we get into it, though, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this evening that we're able to gather. But we do think about those who are not able to gather with us, feeling ill and sick. And we ask that you keep them in your care and comfort them and heal them, that they might overcome their illness, especially Katie and others who have already kind of been through difficulties health-wise. But they're on our minds, they're on our hearts all the time, and we just ask that you kind of help them and do what you can do, and without hands. But we also pray that doctors and others might be helpful as well, that so many of our brethren who are feeling down and sick and are stressed because of all of the difficulties, we hope that you'll bring us all peace and guard our hearts and minds with your peace. We pray these things in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so I'm guessing a lot of the people here are going to kind of know the story of the Gibeonites, right? Who here doesn't really know kind of the backstory of the Gibeonites without reading all of this? Okay. I'll give you a little bit of I'll get a little background to it. So you guys probably weren't here last Wednesday either, were you? Okay, so last week, Rich kind of finished up the battle at Ai, which is that's not working. Let me see if I can change the battery quick. Let me see if that.
Are we dead?
Yes, I need a new AAA. And you can bring me 2. So, Battle of Ai is essentially the second city that they capture in Canaan, but it was a small city that didn't have a lot of people. And so after the great battle at Jericho, and they marched around, 7 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day, and all walls came tumbling down, they went back to Gilgal, and just outside of it a little bit. And then they sent spies over to Ai and said, hey, our spies come back and went, this is a nothing little town. We'll just send like 1,000 people. And then 30-some people die because Ai gets them to retreat, and they leave. And as I wrote up in the daily writing on Joshua and Ai, the great problem that I see, and we're going to see it happen again with the Gibeon, is that, and I think it's a Joshua problem in both of these, to some degree, in both of these situations, because they make a decision what to do without asking God. Well, God has told them every step of the way what to do, every single thing what to do at Jericho. And then they're like, oh, well, this one's easy. I got that. We don't need your advice. And so, and obviously they're defeated there because God's not with them. And the reason he's not with them is because, you guys remember this? What happened at Jericho? Achan? Yeah, remember everything at Jericho, everything was to be destroyed. The city was never to be lived in. That was unlike a lot of the cities. God was giving them all of these cities to live in, but not Jericho. In fact, it was cursed. Anybody who ever lives there will basically rebuild it with the their firstborn under, I can't remember which one's which. Firstborn is going to be under maybe is it the pillars of the gates? I don't remember. And then and then the youngest will be under the corner of the house or something like that. I think it's the corner of the house and the corner of like the pillars of the gates. Not that God was going to kill those children for somebody building there. And in fact, when somebody did build there later, how that ultimately happens is that was one of the rituals that the peoples of Canaan did. They would take some of their children and put them under the foundations of properties that they built as a sacrifice to their gods for blessings. Okay? But anyway, so Jericho was utterly wiped out, and everything in it was God's. Okay? Completely devoted, given to God. It was the first fruits. Ai, then they're supposed to go, and so after that great victory there, Achan, he sees some stuff in there, he takes it back, buries it under the, I guess the mat in his tent. And so after the loss, and I wrote about this, after the loss, Joshua's like, I can't believe you brought us out here just to humiliate us and you just want to kill us out here. And God actually says, because he's bowed down, he's like, get up. You need to deal with the sin in Israel. So he kind of gets, to me it reads like God's kind of a little frustrated with Joshua, a little whiny and complaining about God leading them to this, why weren't you with us? Why weren't you? And it reminds me of me and us, where we think, oh, I got this. This is easy. And then it kind of blows up in our face and we kind of think, well, why? It's like, well, did you ever really think to ask my advice, my wisdom? And so after they finally deal with the sin of Achan, which, you remember how that all worked? They tell them one day, and they say, okay, all the heads of all the tribes got to come the next day. So everybody gets to sleep on it. Next day, heads of all the tribes brought out. And we're going to select which tribe it's in. Then the heads of all of the clans in that tribe are brought out. And we're going to select the head of the clan. Then we're going to select all the heads of the families within that clan. Now, I don't know what differentiated families, clans, and tribes by their measure, but we kind of get the idea. There's some kind of hierarchy down to kind of the small family. And then they take all these families and the heads of those families, and eventually they end up with Achan. So they didn't just kind of like pick on the one guy. They made everybody in the entire nation. Is it in my tribe? Is it in our tribe? And eventually they get to Achan. And what happens to Achan when Joshua tells him, tell the truth, give God the glory, tell the truth, essentially. It kind of sounds, I always talk about this because it's similar to what happens in the New Testament one time. When they kind of say, is that, I think that's in John 9 with the blind man. Is he the one that said, give God the glory? I'm forgetting now. Or is that in Acts? Anyway, there's one place in the New Testament where they say the same thing. And I kind of talk about it. It's probably in Acts. But anyway, I talk about it because when they're saying, hey, tell the truth, give God the glory, they are not saying, like in our modern, system, swear to God, tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth on the stand. That's not what they're like swearing you to tell the truth. It's not what they were doing. What they were doing was exactly what they do with Achan. They already know the truth. They're telling you to say the truth. Yes, they're telling you to admit what you've done. That's what the statement is. And then he does. He says what he's done, and what happens to Achan? Yeah, they stone him. Did they burn all of them too? Yeah. Right, they stone him and then they burn them all. But it's not just him. his whole family, all the family. He has no children. There will be no children from his family. Everybody. Wife, kids, all of his animals, all of his stuff. And they stone him, they burn him, and they heap it with rocks as a memorial of what happened to Achan. And I think it's been a couple weeks now, or I think they mentioned that the rock mound is there to this day, as of the writing when they wrote this stuff down. And so Ai, this great defeat, which isn't huge. 30-some people die, but think about it. That's 30-some deaths that didn't have to die. So anyway, after that, God tells Joshua, after they deal with that and they purify the people again, he tells them, okay, listen, everybody goes to Ai, even though it's small. And then this time, they actually use the original defeat against them by, making the people out in front. They have a kind of a force in the back, but they bring people out front, and then they have them run. And then Ai's, warriors go chasing them. And then that allows the rear forces to come in and destroy Ai. But we learn, so that happens. They deal with the sin of Achan. They finally destroy Ai. And then Joshua renews the covenant. By the way, this is what this map is. So Gilgal's back up in here. Jericho is there. This is Gilgal right there. Jericho's here after that defeat. And then finally, the defeat of Jericho. They're defeated Ai, and then their final conquering, they end up coming to this area here. It's in a valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerashim. And I wrote in the daily messages that, and it's been a while since I was reading about this, but I think I've even seen pictures in a valley. And if you've ever been up off of the highway going to Stanley, what is that from Banks or from Garden Valley, and you kind of heading over east? I think about highway, Billings Sloman. Anyway, if you ever go through that valley sometimes, you can kind of see it. On one side, the mountain's all green with trees, and on the other side, in sections of it, it's like just bare and brown, grass maybe, but in the summertime when you're driving around up there, you're like, oh, just a big dirt hill. And that's what they were in. They were in a valley like that, and they put half of the tribe on one side, they put half of the tribes on the other side. And he speaks to them, the law, renews the covenant of the law, and the law talks about the blessings and cursings. And so I think that was a visual image for them of seeing the blessings and cursings of God sitting in that valley. But anyway, so all that happens up through end of chapter 8. And then we come into chapter 9, and it says, as soon as all the kings who are beyond the Jordan in the hill country and the lowland, all along the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. So these peoples of all this land down here, okay, they decide, listen, because after the renewing of the covenant up here in the valley, they end up going back to Gilgal. Well, these people are like, wait a second, they just destroyed 2 cities. Just utterly wiped them out. We're not just going to sit here. And it isn't like most of these cities are more fortified than Jericho was. And Ai was a fortified city too. I don't think historically it's thought it was as formidable as Jericho or as formidable as Jerusalem, a Jebusite capital at the time. But they're like, well, we should probably all gather together and go attack them. But the real advantage of that for Israel is that they're going to battle out here in the lands and are not going to destroy the cities. Because remember, God is giving them a land flowing with milk and honey. He's not giving them a land that is war-torn and, and all messed up. And so we're going to kill all the armies without destroying all the cities. So anyway, so they're going to gather together, and ultimately they're going to, but in the meantime, we're going to talk about Gibeon. Because Gibeon is another great and mighty city that has tremendous warriors in it, which we learn in this section. But they decide, unlike all the rest of them, we can't beat them. So let's try to join them. But they are apparently aware, because remember, I mean, Israel has been kind of hanging out down around here for 40 years. They probably know somewhat of what's happening, because we've already known at Jericho with Rahab. Rahab talked about the fear of them is throughout the land. The entire land knows there's a big group of people that just conquered Egypt that are sitting right on our southern border. And what are we going to do? And now they've begun to march, and now they've conquered all those kingdoms on the east side of the Jordan and the Dead Sea. And now they've begun to enter into the land. So Gibeon, unlike the others, go, we're going to try and join him, but we're not going to say, hey, would you let us join you? Because they apparently are aware that that answer would have been no to that. And so they have to basically go, well, we have to fool them. Tell them we're from a long distance. And so, this isn't a terribly long distance. And so Gibeon uses all kinds of old food products, old clothes to go, listen, things have worn out. We want to come. We've heard about you. Let's make a covenant with you. And so Joshua and the leaders of Israel, they kind of check it out, right? They check out their food, check out their clothes, check out, and they're like, oh, okay. And they make a covenant. But again, they don't ask God. And I didn't make mention of this in my daily writings, because I don't know that all of us kind of necessarily, we might think, okay, on a daily basis, do you just ask God, should I do this or not do this? For you and I, what do we have to do if we want to know whether we think God is advising us to do something or not? What is our approach to learning the answer to that? Study, pray, and what Proverbs talks about a whole lot, seek out wise advisors. Okay? Proverbs talk about that a lot. You need wise advisors. But that's not Joshua's. That's not what he's relying on. He can go to God at any time and ask a question. How would he do that? Whether God talked to him or not. Because there are times where God reveals things to him, right? But even if God's not directly revealing something to him, how can he go and ask God a question? Yeah, he can go to the high priest. High priest built into the ephod is the Urim and Thummim, or Urim. And if you see I-am in a Hebrew word, it really is im typically. But most people just pronounce Urim and Thummim. But they have that, which we don't particularly know what it is, other than it was a little bit like Lot's, and that God would give an answer. But you could ask kind of a yes or no question, and the high priest would give you God's answer. Should we make a covenant with these people? Would have been a pretty easy question. God could have said yes or no, because were they supposed to make a covenant with the Gibeonites? No. It's not a hard question at all, because every single one of them are supposed to die. Now, they make a covenant with the Gibeonites. And Then they learn the Gibeonites deceived them. And they're from just over the hill. Because this is kind of down towards the Dead Sea. And this is up into the mountains and then kind of down again. So over the hill. Right? And so now they're mad. What would we do if we had made a covenant with people that deceived us?
Our wisdom is we kind of nullify the covenant and say, you misrepresented, so we're backing out of our end of the deal. That's not the way they did it.
No, it's not the way they do it. But you're right. Our modern kind of sensibility is that, if you're not honest in the agreement, then it's not really a valid agreement. Of course, that's also why a lot of legal documents that you sign have written in them, any verbal things that are not recorded here don't count. Legalese way of saying that. So, because a lot of times you talk to some salesperson, and they say all kinds of stuff, and unless it actually says that in the document, doesn't count. So that's why their documents say that. So, and yet you still can sometimes win on verbal, but it's hard to win a legal case. But that's our sensibility. That's not their sensibility. But not just that God doesn't hold them to that. That is not how they understood giving their word. Even the people responded like, first off, they're mad at the Gibeonites. They kind of want to kill them. And Joshua's got to listen, you can't kill them. Because what is the covenant they made? I actually wrote that about it. What kind of covenant is it that happened between Gibeon and Israel? I talked about types of covenants a while back. And lessons and stuff. When was that? So there's peer-to-peer kind of covenants and there's vassal covenants. This is a vassal covenant. This is where people come and say, hey, listen, we'd like a covenant of peace between us, and we would ask you not to kill us, and we will serve you. Okay? I will be your servant. That's what a vassal is. You're not coming to make a covenant of peace from power, from equal power. You're coming with, we are weak compared to you. Please, we will serve you, and we'll keep, and you take care of it, keep peace with us, and you'll protect us. And that's exactly what happens, by the way, which that covenant will lead to this whole battle, if you haven't already read ahead of all that. They realize that they have to keep their word. And we see this isn't just in this. What we see it with even the marriage between Jacob and Leah. Would most people today think that was a valid marriage? Most people today wouldn't do that. Well, I didn't marry her. I said yes to somebody else. You put her behind a veil. I couldn't see her. And yet he understood. I gave my word. That's it. You can see this even in like the judges, which we'll get to later. The judge, when he promises that whatever comes out of his door he will sacrifice to the Lord. Now he's probably referring to the gates of the courtyard of his house. I think, but I don't think he expects it to be his daughter who comes out. But it tells us that after, even she says, well, you got to keep your word. And it says they sacrificed her. Now, people will argue because, which judge is that? Remember? Is that Jephthah? I think it's Jephthah, yeah. So Jephthah, people, he's listed as one of the faithful, and you think, well, that doesn't seem like something one of the faithful would do. But I think one of the problems with that concept is the faithful are not described as the people who didn't do wrong stuff. They all did wrong stuff. The faithful are the people who tried to follow God the best they could, the best they knew how, or when they blew it, they repented. That's what the faithful are. Faithful aren't those, who didn't do bad stuff or wrong stuff. Anyway, so you see it regularly. This entire culture has that sense of, it's like, you say you're going to do it, you just have to do it. It just doesn't matter. It does not matter the circumstances that led you to say yes. You do what you said you would do. And why were they so committed to it? I mean, what's the consequence of not keeping your word? Yeah. So whether they knew God or whether they be pagan gods, they all had kind of said their God was going to hurt them. Their God was going to curse them or come down on them or be angry with them, and they were afraid of God's wrath when they didn't keep their word. By the way, in the law and all in the writings of the Old Testament, there's no place that God says you can break a vow other than if you're somebody who has a higher authority who can say no. So a woman, like a daughter, could make a vow and her father could say no. A woman could also make a vow and her husband could say no. Can't think of any other situations, but every other time it says, if you vow, you do it, without exception. And in those cases, if they only had, and like their husband or father only had like a day to say yes or no. It's not like they could say, well, let me think about it for a week. No, they had to give the answer, and then it stuck. And it wasn't like you could change your mind. You couldn't go to them and go, well, you should say no. No, you were supposed to keep your vow. No. And anyway, so what's interesting about this, and this is kind of looks ahead along quite a ways, what does God think about them having to keep the vow? We actually do know the answer to this. It doesn't come in the book of Joshua, though. It comes in the time of David, so hundreds of years later. And right after David has taken over, Saul had, during this whole time, because once this covenant happens and the deception is discovered, they basically make the Gibeonites servants, woodcutters, and what's the other thing? Water carriers. So they of the Lord. So and Israel, but primarily they're going to serve the temple and the tabernacle, and they're going to, a lot of the work that needs to be done, they're going to be the servants of the work of the temple or tabernacle, and they are faithful to that agreement all the way up into David's time. And there is not long after David takes over, there is a famine, and David asks, why do we have a famine? And the answer comes back because of what Saul was doing to the Gibeonites. He was killing them. David had to stop it. Not only had to stop it, he had to punish Saul's household in order to for what they had done to Gibeon. So we see God holding them to the covenant hundreds of years later, even though they shouldn't have gotten into it in the first place, which I think is an important thing. Sometimes, because you and I might do this, we kind of say we'll do something, and then we kind of realize later, I probably shouldn't have said yes to that. I probably shouldn't have done that. Now, I'm not saying do stuff that would be sinful. I'm just saying, if you said you do stuff and you're like, oh, I shouldn't have said yes to that. I shouldn't have agreed to that. And I'm like, oh, that was a mistake. You should just do what you said you'd do. And the more you do that, by the way, the more you realize I made a mistake in giving my word, but I kept it anyway, even if it was a little painful. Which, by the way, Psalm 15 talks about. David asks, who can go to your holy hill? He who swears to his own hurt and yet still does it. But not that I would expect you to know that passage, but in Psalm 15. The more you do that, the more you will learn to think before you say yes. The more you get out of things, the more you will do that. You'll keep saying yes, or I'll do that, or I'll plan to do that, and then because you've gotten out of it in the past, you just kind of keep thinking you'll get out of it. It's one of those things that young people just have to learn. Because I don't know any young people that don't make that mistake a lot. And then you kind of have to learn it. So, okay. So, why? So one of my get it questions in this worksheet is, why do we sometimes rely on ourselves instead of seeking God's wisdom? Why did Joshua do that? And I kind of hold Joshua primarily responsible. He's the one that has kind of the direct access with God. I don't think he's probably the only one responsible, but I think primarily responsible. What causes us to not seek God's advice and wisdom? Yeah.
In Joshua's case, it's very possible that he thought he knew God.
Probably.
Because he'd been told to conquer kings.
Mm-hmm.
And in my case, a lot of times it's the same thing. I think I know what it is, and so I don't need to ask God about it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, even if it's a difficult decision, one without maybe a clear yes or no, he still tells us to pray for wisdom. So, but yeah, I think that's definitely one of the reasons we think we already know. Yeah.
Sometimes I think we believe it's small and it's within our own capabilities, and we forget how many assumptions that is based on.
Mm-hmm.
We're assuming something about our abilities, the consequences, what could happen, the possible outcomes, and I think we forget how much that is unknown actually.
Mm-hmm.
We know what is going to come, and so therefore
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think a lot of times we do think things are minor. I mean, how often have you had something that you thought was minor turned out to be something huge? It happens all the time. Happens in individuals, happens in families, happens in congregations. 35 years ago, a congregation I was in at the time, some little, thought that there was kind of I'm trying to remember what started all of it. Anyway, something happened. It's like talking, and so some of the people are talking with somebody who had kind of done something, and then then they say something, and you're like, what? And then it just kind of, it was like you kept pulling a thread on that piece of clothing, and you wanted it to just kind of stop, and then instead it just kept pulling. I mean, it ended up a kind of every single person under the age of 20 was involved in that congregation. That was not an old congregation either. There was a lot of people in the teens in that group. And they all knew, a bunch of them were involved. It's like, what a mess. It was a mess for like months. That was just, some stupid thing that somebody did, rather than a whole series of stupid things a lot of people were doing. But that's what happens sometimes. Little things snowball. We think we kind of have it. It's easy. And a great example in that same congregation, by the way. One of the young men I was kind of working with a lot, having real problems seeing his wife. They were young and newly married, and his father-in-law, who was part of a congregation, the whole family, and father-in-law had co-signed on a car for them, and he couldn't afford, when they weren't making the payments, to actually make the payments. And so I don't know if all of you know the scriptures that tell you not to do that. There are proverbs, not to become surety for somebody. And it's one of those things that is a principle. It's not one you couldn't do. But if you do co-sign, you should only do it if you actually could pay it yourself and give it. If you could give it when they can't give it, then probably it's the only time you could maybe do that. But it's a bad idea, even for your family and your kids sometimes, because the banks are telling you the banks don't trust them. No, and so that went south really bad. Became we had two men in the congregation, won't talk to each other and mad at each other and over, co-signing a loan on a car they shouldn't have had in the first place. So that's the kind of stuff that happens all the time, and it didn't seem like a big deal, right? They had jobs, they got these little jobs, they can't get the loan on the car because they don't have enough time or enough money down or whatever, and then oh yeah, we'll co-sign for you. We trust our daughter, trust our son-in-law, and then they lose jobs or something, and stuff happens, and all of a sudden it just kind of grows into a huge mess. So, okay. Any other thoughts on just kind of why we sometimes do that?
Maybe we're afraid of the answer.
Yeah, I think you're right, because, and I think what your statement means is that we really have something we want to do, and we're a little afraid maybe the answer will be no, and so we do it. A lot of people say, well, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission, right? We've heard that statement, right? Sometimes, and so we kind of do things that we think are the right thing, but we know somebody who will give us advice, but it will most likely be a no, and so we don't ask. We kind of just do it anyway. Yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, for sure. The other one kind of goes along with that. If we do ask, sometimes we ask the people we think will give the answer we want. Like which parent you're going to ask, It's like, oh, this is an issue. I should ask mom on this one. Or no, I should ask dad on this one. He's more likely to say yes. Every kid generally knows that. And it might be one parent who's almost always the easier one to say yes. But sometimes it's like, it kind of depends on the situation, what you're actually asking about. Because one parent or another might be harder or more, more compliant or more forgiving, I guess, with your yeses. But kids kind of learn that kind of innately when they're little, and they do the same kind of things. They don't ask because they don't. No, they're not going to want to hear that answer. No. Okay. So after all that happened, how did Gibeon how were they central in the whole battle of the South? I actually do think, to a great degree, one of the reasons God brought them up here and brought them in at this point is that he basically bifurcated Israel so that they ended up with two really distinct battles, or periods of battles. The southern campaign, and then they were able to finish, and then the northern campaign. By the way, as we read this, doesn't it read like it only takes a couple weeks? This seems like a really short span, and that is a pretty short span. But that's kind of right. You're from this place to here, you're rising up almost 3,000 feet, maybe more. And then you're coming down. That's probably like hiking from here, I don't know, if we're going to hike over to, say, Horseshoe Bend. It's not very far. In a car, I don't mind it at all. But if I'm hiking that, how long does that take? So, and we talk about the long day that happens. And then they go back, and then they have these battles, and they go back. And they have a battle, and they go back, and they send spies, and they go back. How long does all that take? When you start counting that up, I think there might be a lot more time in all of this than we sense. But we're not being given a time frame here. We're not being told how long things happen or anything. We're just being given kind of highlights of events. No. Anyway, the Gibeonites. So how does the treaty with the Gibeonites lead to this whole campaign of essentially causes almost, I don't know, a good percentage of the 31 kings that Joshua kills in the south are killed in this southern campaign. I don't know if all of them are, but yeah.
Because of the treaty, the Canaanite kings were mad at Gibeah, so they went to attack Gibeah, and then Gibeah called out to Joshua to come help them. So it was a perfect opportunity to fight all of those kings at once.
Yeah. Yep, and basically Israel's over here going, well, maybe we could slow walk it, and we could have people kill Gibeon for us, because we shouldn't have made that covenant with them. No, they didn't do that, because part of the covenant is that we have to protect you. You're part of us now. And so they stick to their word, and they come, and that leads to this encounter with all of the people. And this is a time frame. I was watching something earlier today about the real William Wallace and the events that led to, in Scotland, his battles with England. And they fought at a specific bridge. His great battle happened at a very specific bridge that you could only get 2 horses wide on. So it was a tiny bridge. But it was the only way for all of the army of England to cross into Scotland. And England thought, well, they're just going to let us, the rules, the chivalrous rules of war will allow us all to come over and get on our side, and then we'll fight. And they went, you're going to kill us. Like 10,000 of you. So no, we're going to destroy you on the bridge. But this is, you can't move massive amounts of troops without people knowing. It's visible. And so that's kind of what happens here. And it allows for the long day. Joshua then prays for the extra long day for them to actually kind of wipe up a lot of these, because they actually end up, 5 kings are killed. That they captured 5 kings that were hiding in a cave, and they would roll a rock against it. We'll come back and kill them later, because they wanted to go keep attacking the armies. And they eventually came back and they killed all those kings as well. So they kill, I think in this one battle alone, they end up killing, I think they count, the count's 10 to 15, somewhere in there. But I just wrote up, next day or two's readings, you'll read about in chapter 13, I think, is where it lists the 31 kings that Joshua defeated here. And a lot of them are not mentioned in any of these battles. So there's a lot more battles that happen than are specifically mentioned. Okay? And so that's why sometimes I think it's hard for us to really get a sense of time. It just, because it reads like, oh yeah, a couple of weeks and it's over. So, okay, we'll keep talking about this little section through next week. If you don't have a handout on this, I'll leave it up here in front. You can come grab it afterwards. But we'll turn it over to, you're doing the singing, right? Okay.
Good evening. If you'd like to mark the invitation song, it will be in the hymnal in number 939. Number 939. And once you've marked your place there, open up one of the supplement books and we will sing number 74. Number 74 in the supplement. 10,000 Reasons. Bless the Lord. Bless the Lord, O my soul, O my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, O my soul, I worship Your holy name. The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing Your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. Bless the Lord, O my soul, O my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, O my soul, I worship Your holy name. You're rich in love and You're slow to anger. Your name is great and Your heart is kind. For all Your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to find. Bless the Lord, O my soul, O my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, O my soul, I worship Your holy name. And on that day when my strength is failing, the end draws near and my time has come, still my soul will sing Your praise unending. 10,000 years and then forevermore. Bless the Lord, O my soul, O my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, O my soul, I worship Your holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, O my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, O my soul, I worship Your holy name. I worship Your holy name. I worship Your holy name. Well, good evening.
It's kind of funny. I've got two groups to speak with tonight. So, obviously, we have some announcements. Several people are sick. Mike, Matt, and Brittany are all home with COVID. Jesse and Lily were exposed to COVID. They're staying home. They were feeling a little under the weather tonight. The Phillips were with the Fewitts, so they're also home. Steve and Yolanda are also not doing well, so they really need our prayers, especially Yolanda there. The Morrisons are also homesick. The kids are doing better, but now Audrey seems to have caught that. Looks like Mary seems to be still under the weather but recovering. Katie and her mother are still feeling sick. Jennifer Fraley has an upcoming surgery on February 8th. She's home isolating to stay healthy for that. And from what I've heard, it sounds like Brian's recovering well from his. So a lot of announcements there. If you know somebody who needs assistance, don't hesitate to reach out to them or reach out to us for assistance if you need it. Every time I hear the word announcements, I go back to a song that I learned at a Philmont Scout camp. And a horrible death to die, a horrible death to die, a horrible death to be talked to death, a horrible death to die. And I hear that in my head every time I hear the word announcements, which leads me to an interesting opener here. I hear a voice in my head. And Janae's over here giving me a look that explains everything. But don't worry, it's my voice I hear in my head. And this is something that I've kind of taken for granted. But I learned recently that I have what's known as an inner monologue, meaning that I talk my thoughts to myself in my head. And apparently not everybody does that. I find it very, very fascinating. I just can't wrap my brain around the fact of not being able to talk to yourself and have those inner dialogues and such in your head. It baffles me. But that makes me think about how we're all different, how we each have different talents. For example, Mindel makes lots of lists. Roger can make anyone uncomfortable, and Ben sings happy birthday. But if we look at those a little bit more in depth, Mindel makes lists because he's less likely to forget things that way. It's less likely for us to forget things if he's making a list of things we need to do. So that helps the group as a whole. Roger can make anybody uncomfortable because he really makes us introspective about ourselves, how we're living our lives, what we can do to be more godly and more helpful toward the group. So that has its place, however entertaining it is. And then Ben sings happy birthday to really concrete the fact that we're a family and life is worth celebrating. But as we look around, we've got people who work in healthcare, retail, technology. We've got people with mechanic skills, home building skills, veterinary skills, people with military experience, and so much more that go into building our congregation. And the two things that we have in common are, first, we sin. We can't escape that. We do. And the second is we want to really throw off our worldly being here and we want to throw off that sin and be more like God. We want to put on God as the scriptures say. And we have an entire well-rounded community here designed to sustain itself and to uplift one another in the eyes of God. So it's, if you're needing help with anything, if you're struggling with anything, with sin, with health, with things at home, it's talk to us. That's why we have these skills and people in so many different areas, is we're here to help. So yeah, if you need help, talk to us. I know most of us in here are Christians and have been baptized already, but if you haven't, if that interests you or you want to, we have a baptistry. It'll be really cold tonight, but we have it. Feel free to talk to any of us. Roger's a phenomenal person to talk to about these things. So don't hesitate to reach out and lean on the congregation, especially as we look at our announcements list that's 3 miles long and realize that we're human. We get sick, we need assistance, so don't hesitate to do so. And Yeah, let's go ahead and we're singing 939.
Student 907.
Okay, we're switching to 907, so.
907, Hark the Gentle Voice. Hark the gentle voice of Jesus fallen tenderly upon your ear. Sweet his cry of love and pity calleth. Turn and listen, stay and hear. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, lean upon your dear Lord's breast. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, come and I will give you rest. Take his yoke, for he is meek and lowly, bear his burden to him turn. He who calleth is a master holy, he will teach if you will learn. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, lean upon your dear Lord's breast. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, come and I will give you rest. Then his loving tender voice obeying, bear his yoke, his burden take. Find the yoke, his hand is on you laying, light and easy for his sake. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, lean upon your dear Lord's breast. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, come and I will give you rest. Thank you, everybody, for coming to study God's Word with us tonight. We will now be led in a closing word of prayer.
Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much that we could come together like we have this evening. Thank you for your word. Help us to have learned from it, learn some things that will help us in our lives that we live here. We thank you that you love us, loved us so much that you saved us. You sent your son down here, and he lived in the flesh, and he died for us. We ask that you would forgive us when we do wrong. We ask that you would please be with those that are sick, that they would be well again. We ask that you would help us during this time of illness, that we can overcome, that people will stay well, and that we can overcome that, and that, Father, we can overcome the sin that we are tempted to. And Father, in Jesus' holy name, amen.
Amen.